Hey, this is Digital by Computing. We're going to go through some enterprise storage solutions. What do you need to set up some storage in a company, in a small, medium, or large business? We're going to be talking about SAN, we're going to be talking about NAS and the different components to get each working. We're also going to cover a bit of backups when storage comes down to your tape media and getting all that stuff off site. So let's check back. As you know, my name is Emilio. We're going to today look at storage solutions. So we're talking about SAN, we're talking about NAS, we're talking about a whole bunch of things that you need to get configured. So we're going to get a little bit technical, but it's going to be good. So what are we talking about when we're talking about storage? Now, we're talking about many different things. If we say in a business sense, we're talking about where the data lives, okay? It's storage. So in a small business, for example, you may have some computers, you've got your servers perhaps set up, and they've got hard drives built in. Those hard drives are limited capacity. So in a storage solution, in a larger business, even in a home or in a small office, you can have what's called a SAN or a NAS. And this is essentially a dedicated device full of hard drives that you can assign to servers, you can assign to different sorts of devices on your network, and then all your storage is consolidated to one single spot. You can have things like redundancy. You can make sure that it's up all the time. You know, there's a lot of benefits to having a separate storage device so that if a computer dies, if a server dies, you are sure that that data is still sitting on a SAN somewhere else. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at a few different SAN solutions. So I've got a few images here of what we're sort of talking about. The big competitors when we're talking about large enterprise storage would be your EMC or now your Dell EMC providers. You've also got NetApp, and there's also Dell also does some other ones as well, which we're talking about large sort of stuff. So if we're looking at EMC, we're looking at something like the VNX series, which is something like this. This has now been superseded, but a lot of companies are still using VNX. So VNX is what is called a SAN. So you can configure this primarily for SAN usage, but you can also configure it as a NAS. So we're going to go into the differences a little bit later on between a SAN and a NAS. But essentially, as you can see, you've got a device like this. You've got, you know, maybe behind here, it's essentially where all the processing power is. So this may have, you know, your CPU, your RAM, all that sort of thing. And on the back, you've got all your connectors where you plug in all your power and your Ethernet cables and things like that. And then there are just rows and rows and rows of disk arrays that are essentially full of disks. All right. Now, disk types can be very varied nowadays. You've got SATA sort of disks. But when we're talking about enterprise, we're talking about devices such as SAS, which are much faster. You've got 10,000, 15,000 RPM SAS drives in 3.5 and 2.5 inch capacity and sizes. You've also got flash-based storage as well if you were looking for something a lot quicker. So this is an example of a VNX. So you would set this up in a company, you'd rack it in a server rack, in a cabinet, and that would essentially store all of your storage, right? So hundreds and hundreds worth of disks, and that would contain all your VMs. If you're running virtual machines, for example, it's going to contain perhaps file servers and things like that so that you can store it all in the one central location. These devices have got redundancy in place, so you don't have to fear of them, dying, that sort of thing. Like if you lose one of these or a hard drive stops working, you've got things called RAID configured, different types of RAID groups, storage pools, and things like that, so that if you have multiple failures, you don't necessarily lose the data if it's configured that way. So that is the VNX series by EMC. You've also got the newer range, which is the Unity drives by EMC as well, which is now Dell EMC Unity. So these are essentially the replacement to the VNX SAN devices. A lot better, a lot smarter. They let you have a lot more capacity as well. You've also got other competitors such as NetApp as well that do something similar. There are other ones such as Isilon by Dell EMC, which is solely a NAS solution. So what are we talking about when we're talking about SAN and NAS? A SAN is what we'll call block level storage, while a NAS is file level storage. Okay, so let's try to do this as simply as possible. If I've got a virtual machine, all right, I've got a Windows Server 2012 R2 server, and that is sitting somewhere. All right, that is physically sitting somewhere. I can actually load what's called VMware. All right, you've also got Citrix Zen server. You've also got Microsoft's Hyper-V, which are essentially hypervisors, where you are running software that manages all of your VMs in single locations. So I can build a VM within a physical server. I can build multiple VMs within one physical server in a hypervisor, right? And have multiple Windows versions. Now those need to sit somewhere, all right? So the VM needs to sit on, if we're talking about VMware, on what's called a Datastore, which is essentially a virtual hard drive, we'll say a large virtual hard drive. And that in turn is sitting on a LUN, which is managed on a SAN. This is block level. So I can't necessarily mount this LUN on a server and read it the normal way that I would if I go into Windows and go to C drive or D drive or E drive, right? It is block level storage, right? And it's managed completely different to what we'll now say is file level. File level is generally, you can connect directly to a file level drive that is configured. So if I have a SAN or a NAS configured, I can create a file component on that. In the case of say a VNX, you can use this thing called a data mover, where you can create your shares. So I can create a share called, files, and then within there I create a folder structure. I add proper permissions and things like that, and then I can share directly into that. I can also map that drive in Windows or on a Mac. I can map to that drive directly by opening up an address bar and going // the name of my NAS server, which is actually a storage device, name of the folder, that sort of thing. You can't do the same thing with a block level SAN component or a LUN. All right, so that's sort of the rough basic overview between the two. There are a lot of different things, but if you think about block level is for LUNs and your file level is for your shares. You've got your CIFS shares, you've got your NFS shares, those sort of things as well. Okay, so these, as we said, these are the different sorts of SAN devices, but they can also be configured for LUNs as well. Now, on the back of each of these units are numerous cables, numerous plugs that need to be connected via cables. You've got your power cables. You've got the cables that run between each one of these, right? So each one of these disk arrays need to be interconnected with each other. They're generally proprietary cables by the manufacturer. They could be other sorts of cables as well, SAS cables, those sort of things that connect from one device to the other. You've also got, for example, Fibre Channel cables. So unlike a normal TCP/IP network, which goes over Ethernet, that's actually another thing. If we're talking about NAS, we can be talking about Ethernet. All right, we're talking about physical connections, physical file shares that travel over TCP/IP, over the TCP/IP protocol, over that form of network. Your SAN, which is block level, can go over Fibre Channel or iSCSI if we're talking about in the SAN world. Okay, so if let's go into Fibre Channel. All right, now you're probably familiar with your network cards. All right, a standard network card which is on the back of your. If we look at a server here, this is a Dell server. So you've got a few network points down here. Right, these can be 1 gig, they can be 10 gigabit. Ethernet, RJ45 ports that you can run your standard Cat5, Cat6 cabling and run them into switches and things like that. They'll each be assigned an IP address, and then you can just connect to it nice and easily. You'll see that there's all these extra slots available on a everyday server. All right, you can run separate cards on here, and what we can run is we can run what's called a Fibre Channel card. So this is what a Fibre Channel card looks like. It's called a HBA card. So a network card would be called a NIC, Network Interface Card, and this is a HBA card. You'll see that these connectors are slightly different. So this is for fiber traffic only. So your fiber traffic on a SAN connecting to a server. So if we're looking at this sort of server, for example, this is a Dell server, will connect to the SAN over fiber, all right, for your SAN component, for your LUNs. So the fiber card, we run a Fibre Channel cable into this, and then you run that into a Fibre Channel switch, which has what's called zones in place, zones configured, so that you can route traffic between all of your devices. So this is what a fiber switch looks like. It's fairly similar to a Ethernet switch. So an Ethernet switch very similarly has a number of different ports. If we're talking about Cisco, a Cisco switch has a number of different Ethernet ports, 1 gig, 10 gig, etc. A fiber switch has fiber ports in this case. So you connect into each of these what's called an SFP module, which you can also do on Ethernet switches as well. And you've got Ethernet SFP modules, but for this exercise, we're talking about Fibre Channel SFP modules. You essentially buy the fiber switch, you buy these little SFP modules that slot into each one of these, and it'll have the connector similar to this, which is on a fiber card, and you run the fiber card that's on the back of a server. All right, so if we're looking at the back of this server, you'll run a cable out of this, which is one of these cables, run the cable out of this into your Fibre Channel switch. On the Fibre Channel switch, you then can configure what's called zoning, and essentially zoning is you're telling the fiber switch, all right, I've got my SAN is all connected into here via fiber. All of my servers are connected into here. You can also connect tape libraries. You can connect many different types of devices. But by setting up a zone, you're essentially saying, okay, well, these two ports, which are one of my hosts, one of my VMware hosts, for example, a physical server, and these two ports are my SAN. I want these two to talk to these two. And so you create a zone to say, okay, well, these two ports, I want them to talk to these two ports. And you create zones. Look, we're not going to go into too much detail on that, but that's essentially how it works with the fiber connectivity. So that is how you'd configure a SAN. So a SAN, as we said, it's essentially a big storage array worth of disks, heaps of disks. You can have terabytes and terabytes, petabytes worth of disks in your environment to easily manage and save and store all of your media. Now, you can also get smaller end SAN devices. So if we're looking at something like this is a large end VNX storage. You've also got our newer Unity SANs. You can also configure, if we're talking about this smaller one, this is a Unity 300, you can use this for what is called for your backup medium. All right, you're probably familiar with backups and what backups are used for. So backups, you back up all of your data from your file servers, from wherever it may be, to a separate location, so that if your files disappear, if you accidentally delete some content, you can restore it from your backups. So what a lot of companies do is they can incorporate what's called disk and also tape backups. A lot of companies will have tape backups and they'll send the tape media off site. A lot of companies also have disk backups as well on top of your tape backups. So in the case of something like this, if we're talking about this, for example, Dell EMC sells a Unity 300, which can be configured as your destination port for your backups. So I can say, if I'm running net backup, Commvault, TSM, Tivoli's TSM, they're all backup solutions that will back up to a certain medium. They can back up to a disk, which is a NAS set up as a NAS, but it essentially can be used as a SAN as well. You've also got other ones such as Data Domain by EMC, and there's other solutions as well, which essentially will back up to a disk-based storage solution, and then that could be replicated to a disk-based storage solution somewhere else, perhaps in a DR site, things like that. And then on top of that, then you can have tape backups. Now, tape backups is something that I would recommend for every single company. Now, why do I say that? Tapes are generally cheaper than disk, all right? But tapes are easily removable and you can easily send tapes off-site. So a lot of companies will have disk backups and they'll say, oh yeah, disk is faster, which it is, and disk is much easier to restore from, which it is. It's all on site, it's all good to go. But you've got to remember that if your disk backup storage is in the same location where your SAN is, that your actual storage sits on the SAN, there's always a potential that that SAN could die, right? You could have a fire in your data center and you lose both. Let's say this is your production SAN and this is your backup SAN. You lose them both, you're dead, right? Let's say a scenario, we've got a DR scenario. You've got one of these sitting in your production site and one of these sitting in your DR site, and they're replicating. You're backing up all the content onto here, and it's also then doing a copy to the other one on the other side. But think of the scenario where somebody infiltrates your system or a virus gets into your system. It starts to infect your content, and that will be replicated over to your DR content as well. So you've got a compromised system potentially. If somebody hacks in, for example, they've got access to both your DR and your production site in some cases. So having a tape medium available is good and essentially a further level of security for all of your backup medium. All right. So this is a tape, right? When we're talking about backups, this is an LTO tape. You've got LTO 2, 3, 4. They're now up to LTO 7 at the time of this video, and they can store terabytes and terabytes worth of data. You have what's called a tape library. This is a smaller tape library. It just puts one tape in there. You're nice and easy. You put the tape in and you back up to that tape. You can then take that tape out and you send it off-site to some off-site provider, whether if it's a different location or you're paying a provider to actually grab that media and take it off-site so that it's stored safely in the case of you need to restore some data. You then go into the bigger end, something like this, which is a Dell tape library. So you can actually put a lot more tapes inside this library. You've got like a HP tape library. Similarly, these are magazines that they just pop out and you can slot the tapes within that, multiple tapes. All right, so what you could do is you back up all of your content onto a disk-based SAN, NAS, and then that also gets backed up onto your tapes inside a tape library, and then perhaps you've got somebody that comes on site every day or every week, takes away your tapes, takes them off site, and then they're all safe from prying eyes, okay? If we're talking about super huge enterprise, we're looking at big mediums. You've got something like SpectraLogic does massive tape libraries, excellent quality tape libraries, or you're looking at hundreds or possibly thousands of tapes. This is completely automated, huge library arms, magazine arms that sort of go all the way up and down the units, and they can go racks and racks, and you can easily just add additional cabinets worth of tapes, which is fantastic. So that is your tape media. So that is a rough overview of our storage. Now, this is enterprise. You've got also smaller end storage mediums available, SANs available. You've got QNAP, Netgear, you've got Western Digital do smaller end SANs and NASs for a small office, for example. If you've got a small office, even a home office, and you can't afford something like this that costs thousands and thousands of dollars. Why would you want something like this? It's crazy. So you'd get a smaller solution that perhaps has 4 or 5 drives. So you can still set up RAID for redundancy. So if a disk fails, you don't lose your data, but they're a lot smaller, a lot more compact, a lot easier to configure, but they essentially do the same thing as one of these, just in a lot smaller scale. You don't have a lot of the functionality of one of these big ones, but it still will work and do what you need. So look, that is an overhaul, an overview of storage. There's a lot more to be spoken about storage. I'd love it if you commented on my video, like this video if you did find it helpful. But look, if you are a storage admin, a storage engineer, comment, give me your tips, give me your suggestions, ideas, critiques. I'd love to discuss storage. I love storage. Super cool. Flash-based storage, if you've got the money, go for flash-based SANs. Super cool, but they cost you tens of thousands of dollars. But look, that's an overhaul. We've got SANs, we've got NAS, we've got fiber switches, we've got iSCSI protocols, we've got your hosts with your HBA cards, you've got tape media, you've got disaster recovery stuff. We won't cover disaster recovery, but that's a whole other little bits and pieces where you can actually have disaster recovery units set up, something like EMC's recover point, where you can replicate the entire SAN over, right? You can actually replicate the entire SAN from one site to another, but that's a conversation for another day. But for now, look, hope you like this video. See you later. So if you found that video helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel, Digital by Computing, just on the button there for more videos.